All right, so we're going to get into the history now. Prehistoric Japan. So Japan has actually been inhabited since the Old Stone Age. That's about 50,000 years, 50,000 BC. Okay, and how do we know that? Well, archaeologists have discovered bone fragments or tools from various archaeological sites in Japan. But really, apart from these basic stone tools, the early Japanese had no technology. This is really all they had. That's why it's called the Stone Age. So where did the Japanese people come from? This is a controversial issue because we're dealing with prehistory, so we don't know for sure. We have to use evidence to figure out where they came from. But actually, during this Old Stone Age, 50,000 BC, Japan was not an island, believe it or not. It was actually connected to the Asian mainland, basically what is now Siberia, through a system of land bridges. So basically, the north of Hokkaido, as you can see here, was not a island like it is today, but it was connected to Siberia through a system of land bridges. So how do we know this was the case? Nobody was there to take pictures, so we must have some sort of proof. The proof is elephant fossils. Elephants normally live on the Asian continent. They are not native to Japan. If you go today, apart from the zoo, you will not see any elephants in the nature in Japan. But we found elephant fossils. So how, if there is no elephants in Japan, and if it's an island and they're not native to Japan, how did they get there? Well, they must have come from the Asian continent where elephants do live. So they wandered to Japan from the Asian continent via those land bridges that used to exist in Japan during the Old Stone Age. Okay, and just like the elephants wandered over from Asia to Japan, the first inhabitants of the Japanese islands also probably came over these land bridges from Siberia, from the Asian continent, to what would eventually become the Japanese islands. Okay, and since Japan was connected to Asia via these land bridges, people would just come by, very often from Siberia. So that's how the first Japanese populated the islands of Japan. They started up from the north, Hokkaido, and then they went all the way south. So that's how the islands were populated. As I've mentioned in the syllabus, Japanese history is divided up into a series of periods or eras, okay? And each era is important because something significant happened in each era that would contribute to the future of Japanese history or civilization. So the very first period is known as the Jomon Period. Okay, it lasted from 10,000 BC to 300 BC. So this is the very first period or era of Japanese history. And the reason it started in 10,000 BC is because this was the beginning of the New Stone Age. And what happens in the New Stone Age is that temperatures become warmer, the ice melts, right, around the world. We're getting out of the ice ages, and when the ice melts, so do those bridges, the ice bridges, the land bridges that connected Japan to Siberia melted. So Japan became separated from the Asian continent and became an island, which it still is today. Okay, so immigration per se from Siberia to Japan via land stopped with the beginning of the Jomon period. Whoever's there gets to stay there. No new people are coming in anymore, at least on foot, at least by walking. So this is the beginning of the Jomon period. What does Jomon mean? Well, this era is actually named after the distinctive Jomon Pottery that was created by the Jomon people during this period. Jo means rope and mon means pattern. And as you can see from this pottery, it's a rope pattern because from the top, and I'll explain in the next slide how they were made. And this is actually the very, very first pottery in the world. The Japanese were the producers of it during the Jomon period. And it was made out of clay, and then potters, of course, made this by hand. There was no technology to make these Jomon pots. And using rope, they actually imprinted rope patterns and designs into the clay. That's why it's called rope pottery, because you have ropes that were actually tattooed or imprinted into the pots, into the Jomon pots. And what were they used for? They were not only used for decoration, and now they are, right? You find them in museums around the world, but at that time, the Jomon people used them to store food and also to cook. So it was used as a cooking vessel and also to store food that had been cooked. The Jomon people did not live in cities, obviously. they, like people do today, they were hunter-gatherers, so they actually rotated between hunting animals, and then during the winter months, they would have to gather, depending on the climate. Okay, sometimes game was scarce, so they would have to gather in the colder months, berries and such, and they would also rely on hunting during the summer months or spring when game was found more easily. And unlike other hunter-gatherer societies around the world, the Jomon people are unique because they actually lived in semi-permanent settlements. So I don't want to say that they lived there permanently, but they didn't wander as much as we thought. Okay, they lived in semi-permanent settlements, so they wouldn't move around quite as much as other nomadic peoples around the world. Okay, so they were quite advanced compared to other prehistoric societies because they did live in these semi-permanent settlements. Again, semi-permanent doesn't mean they were there all the time, but it was more permanent, longer, more lasting than other cultures. And this is an example of the Jomon people. Okay, so generally speaking, there was gender separation. Men would hunt and women would gather. Okay, although men would have to gather sometimes too when game was scarce during the summer months. I'm sorry, the winter months. And unlike most hunter-gatherer cultures, the Jomon people actually had a great knowledge of farming. Okay, they did know, they weren't experts. Okay, they didn't really know how to cultivate rice, for example. That came later, but they did experiment a bit with farming. Okay, and that's very unusual for other hunter-gathering cultures. They planted lots of chestnuts, lots of acorn trees, and then they would harvest them for their cooking. Okay, so that's very unique. And these farming skills, along with the gathering skills that they had, gathering berries and herbs and such, this allowed the Jomon to survive for a long period of time. Because when game was scarce, when prey was scarce in the winter months, this allowed them to have something to eat, right? So not only berries, but you also have chestnuts, you have acorns, right? So you were able to survive during the winter months when it was hard to go hunting, and that's why their civilization lasted for such a long time. Okay? Where did the Jomon people live? Well, they usually lived and settled near the coast because they were also very, very good fishermen. Okay, they loved shrimp and shellfish. Okay, and how do we know that they like shrimp? Well, if you archaeologists, again, everything we know about the Jomon, they didn't have a writing system, so everything we know about the Jomon people is from archaeology. They've actually discovered mounds of shrimp shells, empty shrimp shells, around the Jomon settlements. Okay, so we know they ate a lot of shrimp, a lot of shellfish. We've also discovered Jomon pottery, the pots and bones in these areas. So we know that they were Jomon settlements, and there was always shrimp there somewhere, mounds of shrimp shells. So we know that the Jomon were very, very good fishermen, and they loved shrimp. Okay, so quite an advanced people. They didn't just, hunt prey and get berries. Okay, they were good, farming, harvesting chestnuts, acorns, and also fishing. So quite an advanced people for their day. At first, Jomon people lived in cave. They were cavemen. But eventually, as they moved into these semi-permanent settlements, they moved into things called tateana. And this is a picture of a tateana here. Tateana are essentially pit dwellings it's like not a hole in the ground, but kind of, you have some space. They dig a little bit underground, so you have some space there, and then you have this thatched roof that's covered over you to shelter you from the rain or the snow. And this is where people lived, in these huts, in these pit dwellings, okay, covered by the thatched roof. And you had 4 to 5 people living in each tateana. So not a lot of space, but you had to make do. During the Jomon period, the society was actually classless. There was no social classes, no social stratification. Everybody was the same because you were either a hunter or a gatherer. You had some job to do, and everybody was in the same boat. If there was no food, if there was famine, if they couldn't find any prey, you were all going to die. So there was really no distinction between rich or poor. Okay. And how do we know this? Well, every Jomon settlement we found, everybody was buried in small graves. They were small holes in the ground, so they did, the dead were buried. And the fact that there was no, graves anywhere, no lavish, or huge grave sites, means that everybody was viewed equally, okay, because everyone was buried in the same way. And the Jomon people did believe in lots of mysticism, lots of sorcery. Okay, they believed in magic and nature, shamanism. Okay, and they created something called dogu figurines, and these dogu figurines are half human and half beast. Okay, and they were used by medicine men or shamans to cure ailments and illnesses in their people. Okay, so these figurines were used in these rituals and these shamanistic spells to cure people or to do magic. So the Jomon were very, very much into this sense of sorcery and ritual. And it's interesting that when someone died, the dogu were buried with them in these graves, and then the legs were broken off, as you can see in this picture. And the reason the legs were broken off is so they were buried with the dead person without legs, so that the dead person doesn't come back to life or their spirit doesn't come back. So they were very into this sort of superstitious magic and ritual. And we've also seen pregnant dogu figurines, like in this example. And so historians believe these were used in fertility rites as well. Okay, so lots of shamanism in the Jomon society. And though they lasted for quite a long time, the Jomon period and its way of life, this culture, came to an end in 300 BC. And the reason it came to an end is because you have lots of new people, new immigration coming in from China, from the Asian continent. And at this time, China, even though it's 300 BC, China had an extremely advanced civilization, much more advanced than Japan. The Jomon people had a writing system, etc. And so new immigrants start coming through to the island of Japan by boat, right? There's no more land bridges, so they do have to cross the sea, the ocean. But they were coming in, and when they came to Japan, when they came to explore what we now know of as Japan, when they came to see the Jomon people, they brought new cultural influences with them. And this new cultural influence really changed the Jomon way of life forever. And we'll see what one of these influences was in particular that changed Japan. Okay. So I have three choices for you. I say again, ask your partner, but probably you're not with anybody right now, so ask yourself, what do you think the new cultural influence from China was that came to Jomon Japan in 300 BC? Was it writing? Was it Buddhism? Or was it rice? What do you think? The answer is rice. Okay, Japan learned what is called wet rice cultivation from the Chinese at the end of the Jomon period in 300 BC. And this was such a monumental move, such a big deal, such a big change, that the Jomon way of life, of hunter-gathering and fishing and such, being the only way of survival, came to an end. Okay, if you know how to cultivate rice, you don't need to go looking for prey all the time or move around from place to place gathering berries, because now you can cultivate rice. You can make rice paddies, and start cultivating, start agriculture. So this change, which was already being practiced in China for a long time, that came to Japan with these new immigrants from the Asian mainland and was taught to the Jomon people, the Japanese, really changed the way of life in Japan forever.